Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Ancient History Jewelry Stories podcast, your favorite podcast about ancient jewelry. I mentioned in the last podcast episode that I'm going to be traveling by the time this one comes out, and that these episodes would be a little bit shorter, a little bit fluffier, maybe a little more off the cuff, and here we are. I am delivering what I promised. I did not write a script for this episode. The last 10 episodes have been done with a pre-written script because I'm not great at gathering my thoughts on the fly, but unfortunately this time you're all along for the ride with me as I figure out what I'm going to say while I say it. For those of you joining me for the first time and wondering who I am and what we're even doing here, my name is Melise, and I am a goldsmith trained in ancient techniques who is more than a little bit obsessed with ancient jewelry. Along with these podcasts, I make a series of videos that you can find on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, also called Ancient History Jewelry Stories, under the name moonhoney.jewelry. In this video series, I approach our shared human history through the lens of jewelry, which is, in my opinion, one of the most important forms of art that humans produce. This episode's topic was chosen by my Patreon members. If you are a Patreon member at the $5 a month tier, then you have the ability to vote in polls to determine the topics of videos and podcast episodes. For this one, 73% of you wanted to know about the filigree mystery, how so many cultures ended up with filigree in their jewelry traditions. It turns out there is a very good explanation, and it takes us back over 5,000 years. But before we get into that, if you would also like to be able to vote on polls and have bonus content every month, you can join my Patreon at patreon.com/Ancient History Jewelry Stories. I'm going to be in Paris starting tomorrow, and I'm going to be filming some extra museum content exclusively for my Patreon members. Because I am very stubborn, and the surest way to get me to not do something is to tell me to do it, the only way that you can have a say in what content I make is to essentially buy me a coffee every month. Yes, I am gatekeeping your collaborative opinion behind the cost of a caffeinated beverage. And now, without further ado, let's get into this, let's say, mini episode about the filigree mystery and discuss how so many cultures adopted the technique of filigree in their own jewelry. To start, let's get into the etymology of the word filigree. This comes from the ancient Latin filum, which means thread, and granum, which means grain, which I think does a really good job of describing what filigree is made out of. Very, very thin wires and very small granules of usually gold, but often also silver, and now in the modern world, other metals, like copper, bronze, and brass. I could not find a single list of all of the cultures that use filigree in their jewelry, and I'm not surprised, because it would be easier to tell you the cultures that don't use filigree than to list all of the ones that do. And really, given the elementary nature of this technique, I don't think that there is any metalsmithing culture that doesn't have some element of filigree work in their jewelry traditions. The earliest known filigree comes from Mesopotamia, from around 3000 BCE. This comes from a region of Mesopotamia known as Mardin, where filigree is still very much sought after and is still practiced. Although a lot of people associate filigree with Portugal and Italy, it didn't make its way towards the Iberian Peninsula until about 2500 BCE, which is still quite early. It's believed that these pieces originated from the Middle East and came to the Iberian Peninsula with Middle Eastern traders. It's also likely that metalsmiths in this area were starting to learn and adopt techniques from Middle Eastern traders. Backing it up just a little, what is filigree jewelry aside from being made of thin wire and tiny granules? It's jewelry of an intricate, ornamental, open-work design made by coiling and curving these wires and soldering them together at the contact points. Usually with an open-work background nowadays in the modern world, but throughout history, more often than not, soldered or placed against a solid background, a sheet of gold or silver. Nowadays, filigree is considered a specialty technique, but for the majority of our human history, it was one of the normal things that a goldsmith or metalsmith had to do in their daily work. If I had to describe filigree to somebody who had never seen it before, I would say it looks like metallic lace. Now, back to how it spread around the world. So we already know the earliest known filigree comes from Mesopotamia, 3000 BCE. From there, it didn't take very long for it to start spreading across what we now know as the European continent, showing up in the Iberian Peninsula around 2500 BCE. In the grand scheme of ancient history, that 500-year gap between the earliest known filigree in Mesopotamia and it moving its way to the Iberian Peninsula is not very long. So this technique really started to spread fairly quickly. There are some places in the world where we can be pretty sure that the techniques being used are essentially unchanged from antiquity. India, Iran, and some parts of Central Asia are still using patterns and techniques that are identical to those that were used in ancient Greece. Those areas have been consistently practicing this technique probably since around 2500 BCE, but there are parts of the world where filigree seems to have come and gone more than once, including the Iberian Peninsula. Although the earliest known examples date back to 2500 BCE, it's not really until the 8th century CE that Portugal got into the full swing of filigree production. This time, the technique was brought by Arab migrants. In a similar way, the technique was brought to Spain by the Moors, and from here we can trace its route through Europe, going from Spain to the Balearic Islands, and eventually working its way down the borders of the Mediterranean. Although the importance of filigree in Spain waned over time, Portugal really perfected the craft, as did Italy. Both cultures incorporated their own unique designs into the ancient practice, leading to the distinct motifs that you can find in Portugal and Italy today. This has nothing to do with filigree itself, but just a little side note, Portugal uses an interesting standard for their gold. They use 19.2 carat or 800 gold, which is something that you don't find anywhere else in the world. From the 6th to the 12th centuries, the majority of the filigree work being used in Europe, especially in an ecclesiastic setting for churches and cathedrals, was coming either from Constantinople or was being made in the style of filigree from Constantinople. And while the cultural connection is not quite so direct, Turkey is still a major producer of filigree today, although they favor silver filigree and it is often made with thicker wires than what you're normally seeing. While filigree was a massive part of jewelry in the ancient world, especially in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, it seems that modern Greek filigree does not have a direct line of descendants from ancient Greek filigree, but instead took a circuitous route, coming back to Greece by way of Spain, the Balearic Islands, and then the borders of the Mediterranean. If you were to compare modern Greek filigree to modern filigree from countries where the technique has remained unchanged since antiquity, you would find a great difference both in technique and execution. I think that a lot of people associate filigree with both the ancient world and Mediterranean European countries, but it is also prominent in the northern part of Europe. The Saxons, the Britons, and the Celts all used some form of filigree in their metalsmithing technique. And now, Scandinavian filigree is very important in Scandinavian culture, usually being made of silver, but sometimes being made of silver with gold accents. I'm personally very fond of Scandinavian filigree. I think that there is a sense of humor and a lightness to the shapes and motifs that you find in their jewelry work that is not present in a lot of other filigree work in other cultures. Of course, with the advent of colonialism, filigree spread to the Americas, being brought by Spain. Let me get out my anti-colonial soapbox over here. Mexico, one of the greatest producers of modern filigree, did get their modern techniques from Spain, but I have to clarify. Pre-Columbian indigenous cultures of the Americas were practicing various forms of filigree well before that asshole Christopher Columbus came around to screw everything up. There are incredible examples of filigree technique from many pre-Columbian cultures, both in the traditional form, made with wire and granules, and made using the lost wax casting technique, where the filigree design would have been rendered in wax before being cast in gold. Based on the research I've done, it seems to me that the Americas represent the only instances of filigree being adopted independently of the rest of the world, but that doesn't mean that that's necessarily the case. It just means I haven't been able to find evidence of another culture that came up with the technique independent of the ancient examples from Mesopotamia and the Iberian Peninsula. All right, so we've got a brief history of how filigree came to spread across most of the world. But what makes this technique so enduring? Why is this still so beloved over 5,000 years after it was first invented? Well, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that filigree is a technique that requires a great amount of skill, and it's a technique that requires somebody to have a sense of imagination about the jewelry they're creating. Every piece of filigree was made by hand. It is not a technique that can be duplicated or mass-produced. In order to create filigree jewelry, a metalsmith has to have their hands on every step of the process, usually starting by creating the twisted wire and the granules that are going to go into the piece. In our world of fast fashion, where even luxury jewelry is often made by 3D printing the wax model before casting, filigree represents true artisanal, handcrafted work. And while motifs and patterns can be reproduced from one piece to the next, each one is going to be a little bit different because there are, of course, people making these pieces with their hands. There's room for error, there's room for personality, and there's room for interpretation, which is how so many cultures manage to create their own distinctive styles of filigree. Here's a little tidbit for my jewelry lovers. If you're familiar with filigree, especially antique filigree, then you are probably also familiar with the technique of canetille. Canetille differs from modern filigree in the way that it is built up to create more three-dimensional forms, and it involves more of those little granules than standard filigree, which usually focuses on the thin twisted wires. Now, canetille is actually what ancient filigree looked like. There's a distinction made nowadays because we are used to seeing more open-work filigree without an opaque or closed background. But up until, I'd say, the 16th or 17th century, all filigree was canetille. Now, what is not filigree? Pierced sheets. Any design or piece of jewelry that started out as a solid sheet of metal, with the design being pierced or sawed out of it, is not filigree. That is an entirely separate technique, even if the final product looks similar. And that, my friends, is what I have for you for this episode about the filigree mystery. Despite this being a technique that's been in use for over 5,000 years, despite this technique having spread across the globe, despite nearly every culture practicing some form of filigree in their metalsmithing techniques, there really is not a lot of gathered information. Sure, if you delve into specific cultures, you can learn quite a bit about their motifs and their techniques, say Portuguese filigree or Mexican filigree, but this is a technique that has sort of been taken for granted as a standard part of metalsmithing culture. So for now, we're going to have to leave it off here. I do hope to visit some ancient filigree pieces when I'm at the Louvre next week, and I will definitely be posting videos of whatever I come across. This will come as a shock to nobody, but I myself am a huge lover of filigree. It's one of the first forms of metalsmithing that I fell in love with, and I've been fortunate enough to pick up a few pieces around the world in my travels. So, selfishly, I would love to know more about the history of filigree, and I hope that we can revisit this topic in the future with a little bit more knowledge to back it up. If you would like to share any information with me about your country or culture's filigree techniques in their metalsmithing, please write me an email. You can send it to hello@shopmoonhoney.com. I would be so grateful for any information shared in the hopes of coming back to this very interesting topic. And now we've come to the bit where I tell you how you can find me. If you'd like to watch my videos on ancient jewelry history, you can find me on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube under moonhoney.jewelry. If you would like to see the jewelry that I make and my metalsmithing work, especially how I interpret ancient metalsmithing techniques, you can find that at shopmoonhoney.com. If you'd like to join my Patreon, you can do so at patreon.com/ancienthistoryjewelrystories. And if you'd like some merch, you can find that at merch.shopmoonhoney.com. As always, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time for more ancient history jewelry stories.